Parshas Noach. I figure since we haven't yet studied Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari, I figure we should have something to do with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. What do you think my favorite Zemira is to sing on Parshas Noach? Who can guess? There's a Shabbos morning Zemira that we sing on Shabbos. And why is it appropriate for Parshas Noach? Yes? Sure. There you go. Okay, so let's go over the words. Excellent. Yona Matzah. Yom Shabbaton ein lishkoach. Starts off with the words, the day of the Sabbath you mustn't forget. Zichro, it's the very remembrance of it is kareach hanichoach, is like a savory fragrance of a sacrifice. Yona matzavo manoach. The dove found respite on the Sabbath day, because according to our tradition, the dove that didn't fly back was on the seventh day that it didn't fly back. It was on the seventh day, which was a Shabbos. So that's what we're celebrating on Shabbos when we sing this Zemira, that this is the day that the Yonah, that the dove found respite. Yonah matzavo manoach, v'sham yanuchu yegi'ei choach. And this is also the day when people who are weary can come to a rest as well. So that's the opening Zemira, and it was composed by none other than Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And how would you be able to detect that? Because if you look at the acrostic of the 5 stanzas of the Zemira, it spells out the name Yehuda. Okay, so that's one of the many songs that we have from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi that's part of our regular liturgy. And the same Yehuda Halevi that composed the Kuzari. So let's just talk a little bit about that whole concept of finding respite. There's an interesting medrash, because really Shabbos represents this whole concept of manoach, of finding respite. Our sages question the very name of Noach. At the end of Parshas Bereshis, the Torah says that his father called him Noach because Zeh yenachamenu mima'asenu u'mi'itzavon yadenu min ha'adama asher erara Hashem. Because he said, this child will comfort us from all of our handiwork and from all of our sadness that we derive from the earth or the soil that God has cursed. Meaning that, according to Rashi, this is the simplest understanding, is that during Noach's lifetime, mankind discovered the plow. And Noach therefore represented a joyous time in human civilization, and the advancement of human civilization is that people were learning now how to better harness the soil. But why the Torah has to point this out to us, that this little boy who would eventually be the father of all humanity and would save the world through his ark, why he had to be called Noach because of an event that happened in general human civilization, doesn't seem to really provide us with the full explanation. Clearly there is some foreshadowing here of Noach's role of being a Noach, of providing some kind of respite and comfort to humanity. And it's quite interesting that the Medrash understands this as well. The Medrash says that there's a machlokes between 2 great rabbis as to why his name is Noach, even though the pasuk clearly tells us that he would act as a comfort. So Rabbi Eliezer says that his name is Noach because it says in the pasuk, after Noach got off the flood, he offered a korban, and it says, Vayar Hashem es reach hanichoach, that God saw the savory fragrance of the sacrifice that Noach brought. And the word nichoach is a play on the word Noach. And that's one of the opinions that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi incorporates in the opening line of the song. Yom Shabbason ein lishkoach zichro kireach hanichoach. So that's the one allusion to Noach. But then, the other opinion, which is Rabbi Yosef or Rabbi Chanina, says that his name was called Noach not because of God smelling the fragrant aroma of Noach's korban, but rather because of what it says beforehand when it says that Vatona Chateva, that the ark came to a rest. And the word Vatanach, the ark came to a rest, is from the word Noach. Vatanach, Noach, came to a rest. And that's the second line of the Zemira of Yonah Matzah. Right? Yonah Matzah vo Manoach. That the dove found respite. Everything came to a rest for the dove. And so perhaps we could suggest that the basis of this dispute between these two rabbis in the Medrash is what is the greatest consolation to a human being after having suffered great tragedy and loss in life. There are two ways to look out after having gone through either a personal tragedy or a community tragedy and trying to find comfort after it's all over. One is to say to yourself, the ark has come to a rest. The turmoil is over. And we can finally take a breath of relief, catch our breath, come back to ourselves, come to a sense of serenity and peacefulness. The trouble is over. That's one way of finding comfort. And that's one reason why Noach's parents called him Noach. But the other opinion, which has to do with the fragary aroma, is a much deeper reason, I think. And that is the greatest consolation is the knowledge that life can go on after that. It's not just enough to know that the trouble is over and you don't have to suffer through the storm, the turbulence of the storm. Everything has come to a rest, you're at peace now. There's an even greater consolation that not only can everything come to a rest, but that you can actually be productive after a life of having gone through great turmoil and stress and turbulence and tragedy in life. That's the way that the other rabbi understands it. He says that's the greatest Noach, that's the greatest Nechama. The greatest consolation is that Noach is not just the person who represents everything coming to a rest, but he's also the representative of productivity, of being able to appreciate and serve Hashem with joy, even after having gone through witnessing the entire annihilation of the entire world. Noach can still pick himself up and offer thanks to Hashem with joy and show Hashem how much he loves him because he's able to find some level of perspective in understanding that there's a divine plan involved. Sometimes all we can do is thank God for giving us a little bit of respite, but we should strive also to be able to go beyond the respite of Shabbos and offer our own Reach Nicholach on Shabbat. Shabbat has both components, and that's why we sing this on Shabbos. That's why Shabbos is so related to the whole story of the flood. There's Zachor and there's Shamor. There's the positive aspect of Shabbos, and then there's the protective aspect of Shabbos against negativity. Shamor is Yom HaShabbos L'Kadasho. Shabbos is protective of us all because it grants us the respite of a turbulent work week, of a turbulent week where there's a lot of stress and a lot of things going on. And we have to carve out space for ourselves to find that manoach, to find that respite. But Shabbos is also the time of Zachor. You have to remember the Shabbos day and have some level of spiritual productivity on Shabbos, where it's a time when you can offer your own sacrifices up to Hashem, create your own reach nichoach, this savory fragrance for God that you can offer up to Hashem that is different from any kind of avoda that you do during the rest of the week. And the savory fragrance isn't just the cholent, it's much, much more than that. It's the way that we daven, it's the way that we sing, it's the way that we clap, it's the way that we dance, all going back to what we started with. So you should have a good Shabbos this week, and you should sing, you should dance, you should clap, you should have a reach nichoach. Let's talk a little bit about the shir that I gave last night. It's interesting because every community and every shul has a slightly different culture. And obviously, when you come from California, your culture is a little bit more, well, it's different, shall we say, from a culture, let's say, up north and back east. And one of the things that we noticed was a little bit different is that the tradition was to have a more subdued kind of prayer service, where clapping and dancing and things like that traditionally haven't always been encouraged. And one of the things that we've been trying to to implement as a different kind of environment during the prayer service, certainly for Kabbalah Shabbos, which I know many of you aren't able to attend, but there's a lot more clapping and dancing. It raises the question, of course, is this even permitted on Shabbos? And that's certainly something that needs to be surmounted if we're going to be able to change the culture. And so we know that it takes place on Simchas Torah. Certainly no one seems to have a problem with dancing, clapping, and singing on Simchas Torah. And actually this is something that's brought in the poskim, that Simchas Torah is considered to be an exception to the normal standards of decorum that a person is supposed to maintain inside the synagogue. But there's something far more important that needs to be addressed or redressed before we can even look at the halachic sources. And that is, why is it important, in my opinion, to create a more joyous and loud and dancing and clapping kind of environment inside the shul, if it would seem to be somewhat more decorous to have a more subdued kind of prayer service. It seems to me, and this has been confirmed to me by others, that one of the reasons why people have lost, especially younger people, have lost interest in davening is because it doesn't have the same kind of emotional and sensory stimulation that so many other things that are outside the shul are offering to us. And in order for us to be able to make a shul a more attractive place, it really has to try to pull on the heartstrings of people who are looking for that kind of emotional and sensory stimulation. I went to a Simchas Beis HaShoeva last week. Was it last week? Yeah, I think it was last week. It was Sukkos. And I went down south. Rabbi Miller was holding a Simchas Beis HaShoeva at the Kollel, and someone was explaining to me. It was hard for me to hear what he was addressing, but apparently every year he talks about the problem of happiness among yeshiva bachurim. That's the number one problem that yeshiva bachurim have, and why they drop out of yeshiva is just because they get depressed. And it's a serious problem. Happiness is a serious problem. It's something that many religious thinkers believe is directly affected by the way that we modify our behavior. If we behave in a happy way, we'll eventually be happy people. And so we have to try our best to try and do things, especially in a communal setting, that'll help make us happy. And especially, when you live in a climate where it's cloudy for 6 or 7 months out of the year, you have to work even harder. You have to work even, and I say this in all seriousness, you have to work even harder on trying to be happy and creating an environment of happiness. And so I wanted to share with you something that the Rambam writes at the end of the Laws of Sukkot. It's the very last source on the very last page of your source sheet, where it says Rambam Hilchos Shofar v'Sukkah v'Lulav. The Rambam, the laws of Shofar, Sukkah, and Lulav. He says as follows. He says, Hasimcha she'yismach Adam ba'asiyat hamitzvah. The definition of joy, when the Torah says, V'samachta b'chagecha, you shall rejoice on your holiday, the definition is that a person has to rejoice in the performance of a mitzvah, uva'ahavas hakel shetziva bahen, and has to rejoice in the love of God who commanded these mitzvot. Avodah gedolahi, this service or this mitzvah of simcha, it's a big job. It's basically what he says. Anyone who deprives himself of this joy, such a person deserves to be punished. Shenamar, as it says, Tachas ashelo avadetas Hashem Elokecha b'simcha uvetuv leivav. The Torah in Parshas Ki Tavo lists an entire litany of terrible, calamitous things that will befall the Jewish people. And there's one pasuk that's quite frightening, and it says, you know why these things are going to happen to you? Tachas, because ashelo avadetas Hashem Elokecha, you did not serve Hashem your God b'simcha uvetuv leivav, with joy and a good heart, meirov kol, when you had it all. Now, there are many different ways to interpret that pasuk. The Arizal says that the words meirov kol, out of an abundance of everything, is going back on the way that you're supposed to have simcha. And what the Torah is trying to explain to you is that you have to have more simcha in serving Hashem than anything else that gives you simcha in life. So if you have great joy in listening to music or playing music, you have to have even more joy in the way that you serve Hashem. If you get great joy out of eating a certain kind of food, you have to have even more joy when you're serving Hashem. If you get great joy in, I don't know, parachuting out of a plane, then you have to have more joy when you're serving Hashem. That's the way that the Ari learns this pasuk. But the Rambam says even the simple understanding is, if you served God but you didn't serve Him with joy, then you're guilty. And not only are you guilty of not performing one mitzvah, but the Rambam says that you're punishable. The way that many of the Mefarshim understand it is that when is a person happiest in life? When are you really happiest in life? What are the happiest moments of your life? When you think about it, what would you say the happiest moments of life are? When you're at a simcha, you feel fulfilled. And you know why you're so happy at a simcha? Because you feel a sense of, we accomplished this. We can actually see our son or our daughter or other family member do something wonderful with their lives, and I feel a sense of, I've done something with my life. I've brought my child to the chuppah, or brought my child to the bar mitzvah, or whatever it is. Whenever you feel fulfillment in things that in meaningful accomplishments in life, that's what gives you the most happiness in life. When you complete a task that you know makes a difference and it gives you a sense of gratification because it's meaningful, those are the things that give you the greatest joy in life. So if you do a mitzvah without joy, then that's actually a reflection on your attitude towards the mitzvah. Your attitude towards the mitzvahs is not meaningful. It doesn't give me a sense of accomplishment and a sense of purpose. I do it because I have to. And if you're doing mitzvahs without that sense of accomplishment and purpose, then you're really losing the whole objective of the mitzvah to begin with. And that's why the punishment is so harsh for a person who doesn't serve Hashem with simcha. But anyway, the Rambam says it's a very serious issue. V'chol ha-megis dato, we continue, the Rambam says, anyone who megis dato really sort of elevates their own thoughts, elevates their own ego. V'cholei kavod la'atzmo, and tries to allot honor to himself. Umiskabei be'inav, and says, I'm such a respected member of the community. It's not appropriate for me to partake in this public display of joy because I would have to ruffle my hair a little bit and, grab some arms and jump around a little bit. The makomos elu in these types of situations and does not display simcha because it's a disturbance or disruption of the decorum of either myself or what I feel ought to be the proper order. Such a person, says the Rambam, is choteh v'shoteh. He is a sinner and he is a fool. Ve'al zeh hizir Shlomo ve'omar al tithader lifnei melech. And about that, King Solomon said, don't glorify yourself in front of the king. When you're standing in front of Hashem, don't worry about how your clothes look. Do what's best for the king. V'chol ha-mashpil atzmo u'mekel gufo b'makomot elu, and anyone who instead humbles himself and does not make much out of their own personage and allows their own personage to be compromised in these situations. Hu hagadol ha-mechubad ha-oved me'ahava. That is the person who is truly great and truly honored, he who serves out of love. V'chein David melech Yisrael amar. This is what King David said. I mean, you probably are familiar with this story. The story about David and Michal. You know why Michal was punished. She never had children. It's because when King David was successful in retrieving the ark from it being in captivity with the Philistines, as they were bringing the ark back into Ir David, back into the area adjacent to the Temple Mount, King David, as he sees the ark being restored to the Jewish people, starts going into a dancing frenzy, starts dancing feverishly. And his wife Michal says, David, King David, how can you act this way? You're the king of Israel. Have you no self-respect? Have you no sense of honor for the monarchy? So what does King David respond? He says, V'nakloti od mizot, v'hayiti shafal be'enai. He said, I should really be even lower than the way I'm behaving now, and be truly humble in my own eyes. Ve'en hagidula ve'hakavod, because as the Rambam says, true greatness and true honor comes only from lismoach lifnei Hashem, comes from rejoicing before God. Shenamar, as it says, the Hamelech David mefazeiz umecharker lifnei Hashem, that King David was jumping around and dancing in front of God. So that's the conclusion of the Rambam, is that you want to have true honor in life, you want to feel a sense of self-respect, knock yourself out if you're going to do it for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's in that context that we frame our discussion of how to comport ourselves when we're in the synagogue. So, really whooping it up inside of a shul, if it's for the sake of davening and for showing glory to Hashem and how enthusiastic we are about our tefillah and about our joy just being here on Shabbos together with our wonderful, beloved community serving Hashem together, then that's the greatest honor that we can give, even in a synagogue setting. So it's in that context that we presented the technical ideas of the shir, because there really is a very specific halachic issue that has to be addressed very carefully, and that is that the Gemara, actually the Mishnah, states that on Yom Tov and on Shabbos, a person is not permitted to clap, to slap his thigh, to make noise, and to dance. It's not permitted on Yom Tov. It's not permitted on Shabbos. And the reason why the rabbis forbade this is a rabbinic injunction that the rabbis instituted, according to the Mishnah, Shema Yitakein Kalei Shir, that it may lead a person to fix musical instruments on Shabbos or Yom Tov. And so in order to distance a person from coming to play music on Shabbos, and playing music on Shabbos in and of itself is not forbidden either, biblically. It's not a malacha on Shabbos. But if you play a musical instrument, you may break a string, and that will require you to fix the string. And therefore, the fixing of a musical instrument is itself a malacha, is itself a violation of Shabbos. So the rabbis placed this very large restriction on playing music. And in addition to playing music, they placed a restriction on dancing and clapping on Shabbos as well, because that's related. That usually is accompanied many times by music. It may surprise many of you, but there were communities in the 18th century, in the 19th century in Europe, that on Simchas Torah the practice was to hire Gentile musicians to come into shul and to perform this whole symphony orchestra of music to accompany the hakafos, so that when we would give honor to the Torah, it would be done with music. And this created a great controversy in many different Jewish communities throughout Europe. Was this mutter or was this asur? While there were many, many rabbis who said it's asur, and eventually that became the prevailing opinion, which is why to this day no one would ever dream of doing such a thing. And God forbid, no one should ever misinterpret that I'm suggesting that we go back to that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But there were rabbis who defended the practice based on the fact that on Simchas Torah, which would be the highest point of our joy, showing true honor to the Torah and to Hashem, we should do whatever we can to enhance that joy by having music present. We don't do that anymore. There's also an interesting dispensation that's offered by Rav Hai Gaon, one of the rabbis of the Gaonic period, which I believe Rav Hai Gaon either goes back to either the 9th or 10th century, who argues that on Simchas Torah there's an exception to the rule of the normative prohibition of clapping and dancing, based on the fact that on Simchas Torah you have to show proper honor to the Torah. You have to show kavod HaTorah. And in order to show kavod HaTorah, the rabbis were willing to suspend the prohibition of clapping and dancing. There's another leniency that's offered by Tosfos, the great Tosafists who live in the medieval period that are the commentaries on the Gemara. Tosafists argue that since today people are not so well versed in playing musical instruments, there's less of a concern that a person who's going to be dancing and clapping may come to fix a musical instrument, because nowadays we don't know the art of, most people don't know the art of fixing musical instruments. And it's on that basis that Tosfos says that the decree doesn't apply at all today. Now these opinions are all brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. And there seems to be a bit of a dispute between the Mechaber of Yosef Karo, who's the posek primarily for Sephardic Jewry, and for the Ramah, who's the primary arbiter of halacha for Ashkenazic Jewry. The Mechaber is more machmir and says that normally, under all situations, it is prohibited to clap and to dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But he provides, even the Mechaber, who's more machmir, provides one leniency, and that is based on the Gemara Yerushalmi, which says that if you do it in a different way than you would normally clap, then clapping is permitted. So you may have even seen some people on Shabbos clapping like this. This is based upon what's brought down in the Gemara Yerushalmi, and it's quoted by the Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch, that clapping with a shinoi is completely permitted on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And so therefore, even if a person wishes to be machmir, certainly to clap this way would be one way of obviating the problem, or obviating the prohibition. But Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, says, like Tosfos, and he says that many people, first of all, even if we tried to protest, it's unlikely that we would get that much participation from the general population. And the Gemara does say, in many instances, including in this instance, that if you know that there's a practice that the masses participate in, and it's very unlikely that you're going to be effective in trying to get them to change, mutav shiyu shogegin v'al yu mezidim. It's better not to make a public protest in order to get people to change if you know they're not going to listen to you. That in itself is a very difficult topic, which probably needs to be addressed at another time, because it's a very, very large and encompassing subject. This whole idea that if you know that someone's not going to listen, it's better not to rebuke them and to point out to them when they're making a mistake. We have to know when to apply that principle and when not to apply that principle. And we won't discuss that today. But that's the first thing that the Ramah says. This has become a pervasive practice. But then he says, perhaps the reason why it's become so pervasive is because, as Tosfos says, the prohibition no longer applies in the first place, because we don't know how to fix musical instruments as well as they used to in the olden days, in the times when the Gemara was written. So it's on that basis that much of Ashkenazic Jewry is lenient on the issue of clapping and dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even when it's not Simchas Torah. But even then, there are rabbis who are machmir. One of the great poskim who is machmir and says that even Ashkenazim should not clap and sing on Shabbos is the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, the Chafetz Chaim, says that a person should conduct himself in a more stringent fashion and should not clap and dance on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But I have to also qualify the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah, in his Biur Halacha, which is the accompanying commentary to the Biur Halacha, to the Mishnah Berurah, also quotes from a sefer that was popular in a generation before he lived. So he says, Baruch Hashem, I was able to get my hands on this book, and I actually make a note of this on page 2. He quotes from a sefer called Zichron Yosef. That's the English text that I have quoted for you on this sheet. And he says that in the Sefer Zichron Yosef, he quotes it verbatim, and he says that in addition to the prohibition that is well known of dancing and clapping on Shabbos, there is another issue, another evil that arises from clapping and dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Can anyone guess what that evil is? It may lead to mixed dancing. It's basically what the Biur Halacha says. The Biur Halacha says, quoting from the Sefer, that the reason why we have to really clamp down on dancing is because, these kinds of these kinds of very animated celebrations usually have men and women dancing together, and this will lead to mixed dancing, and it leads to men and women holding hands. And he says not only are the people dancing, but the Satan is dancing with them in these very unsneous, these very precistic kinds of gatherings. Now, there's tremendous validity to what the Bir Halacha is saying. I mean, you've probably been to a chasana where even despite the fact that there's a mechitza that runs through that's very, very high, eventually the father of the bride makes his way over to the kala's side, to the women's dancing, because, of course, he's entitled, he's the father of the bride, so he should dance. But then his brother, Uncle Harry, who's not necessarily that frum, he says, well, if my brother can dance on the women's side, so I'll dance on the women's side too. And then Uncle Harry's kids all come over to the women's side then as well. And then eventually you got a whole minion over there of men. So the men say, well, the rabbi didn't say anything, so of course it must be okay. So then, and this is how these things happen, right? Of course, this is how these things unfold and start to deteriorate. So there's no question that we have to be very, very careful in making sure that situations don't deteriorate. But I believe that one of the reasons, or at least one of the reasons why the Mishnah Berurah was so stringent is because it's clear from his other writings, not just in the Mishnah Berurah, but in other of the Sfarim that he wrote, that the Mishnah Berurah had felt a responsibility to wage a very serious battle in the generation in which he lived in the early 20th century. And that is that he took note of the fact that there were tremendous breaches in rules of modesty between young men and young women in the generation in which he lived, where boys and girls were holding hands on the streets, a new phenomenon that he had never witnessed before in his life. And he really felt it was quite important for him to repair those breaches. And it's therefore altogether possible that he perceived that this whole concept, the whole issue of dancing and clapping and raucous kinds of celebrations had the air of danger to it that perhaps would not necessarily be as dangerously perceived in a different setting, and perhaps certainly not in a synagogue or in a shul where the men and the women are seated in different sections. I raise that as in the Torat Efshar. This just is a possibility that even when we look at the authority like the Mishnah Berurah, who is more machmir, we have to also understand in the context in which he is writing these words. But let's take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan together. The Aruch HaShulchan is written by Rav Epstein around the same time that the Mishnah Berurah is being composed, perhaps a few years before, which is also a very, very accepted halachic authority. As a matter of fact, I know of certain rabbis, when I was growing up in yeshiva, the Mishnah Berurah was always the go-to authority, and he trumped everybody. Today, it seems that the Aruch HaShulchan has gained much more popularity as being on equal par. Sometimes even some people prefer the authority of the Aruch HaShulchan over the Mishnah Berurah. But let's take a look and see what he says. It's on the bottom of page 2. He says, "Ulaniyas daiti nira tam pashut." He says, it would seem to me clearly a very simple reason why there's no reason to prohibit clapping and dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. He says, "Desipuk v'rikud shalanu lo ne'esra me'olam." He says, the kind of dancing and clapping that we engage in was never part of the prohibition to begin with. "De bizman chazal hayazeh be'et shemizamrim b'chlei shir." In the times of the sages, the type of dancing that they were referring to and the type of clapping was the type of dancing and clapping that was accompanied by music. That people had a much more choreographed form of dancing, a much more disciplined and organized kind of clapping and dancing. They would use the rhythm of the music itself to determine how they took steps in the dance on the dance floor. Someone asked me if there's anything like that today. So I said, well, when I was getting bar mitzvahed, it was the hustle. When you went to I don't know if I'm dating myself, but in those days, everyone got on the dance floor as you got to do the hustle, right? So everyone's got to take this step this way. Don't ask me to imitate it. I wouldn't be able to do it. But that's that kind of choreographed kind of dancing maybe what it says that Aruch HaShulchan is what Chazal were referring to. Do they do that in Zumba too? I mean, or is it every lady for herself? I don't know. But he says that kind of dancing. He says V'chein mashma Yerushalmi. This seems to be the import of the Talmud Yerushalmi. Aval achshav ein ze klal ba'et shemezamrim b'chlei shir. He says that doesn't occur at all today. He says because when they play music, that's not when people are dancing. He says, Ela b'eit sheshorerim bepeh, shirei simcha, metavchim kaf el kaf tipuach ba'alma. He says when people sing with their mouths is when we sort of clap, just a sort of a what he calls just putting two hands together. V'lo al pi sidrei hashir, not trying to coordinate rhythmically in some kind of very choreographed and stylized kind of clapping. V'hach d'sipur kaf yarech lo nadal lanu klal. He says, and what the Mishnah describes a practice that we don't even know of at all today, which was the type of slapping on the thigh that people used to do again to help to try and choreograph the music and the dancing. V'gam harikud be'et hasimcha eno karikud shalahem b'seder kirikudei nashim. He says similarly, the type of dancing that we do today when we have a simcha where a bunch of clumsy men get it together in a circle and try to not avoid stepping on each other's toes, that's not the kind of dancing that's described in the Gemara, in the Mishnah. That type was the type of what he calls rikudei nashim. That's like in the old days it was everyone, I'm just thinking, although it's probably an anachronistic kind of depiction, but just imagine everyone in powdered wigs and the men are bowing and the women are curtsying and then they're dancing, everyone's twirling around and stuff like that. He says that's the kind of very choreographed, stylized kind of dancing that Chazal were making reference to, where there was this kind of very, very choreographed thing, and if you didn't know the dance, you got thrown out of the ball. And he says, Ve'en kan geder shema yitaken klishir. He says, therefore, today, our clumsy kind of clapping and dancing, there's no fear that you're going to want to fix musical instruments as a result of this kind of activity. De'en lahem shayachut zeh lazeh kalal. This is because there's no relationship whatsoever. V'lo al zeh gazru chachamim. That's not what our sages were making a decree upon. V'lachein gam b'simchas Torah. He says, therefore, on Simchas Torah, for sure, when we dance and we clap in front of the Sefer Torah, he says, some say, and he's quoting Rav Haigon that I mentioned earlier, that it's only because of Kavod HaTorah, that out of the honor of the Torah, that the rabbis made an exception to their rule. He says, he says, how can you tell me that the rabbis would suspend the rabbinic injunction because of Kavod HaTorah? We never find a precedent like that. Once the rabbis make a decree, the decree stands in all circumstances. You can't say just because you want to show honor to the Torah, you're going to dismiss with a rabbinic prohibition. That seems to be quite frivolous and quite dismissive and cavalier in your attitude towards a rabbinic prohibition. He says, really, the reason is, as he's been saying all along, is that the type of dancing that we do on Simchas Torah is not the type of dancing that was ever included in the prohibition. And he says, we see great, he says, as he says in the bottom line, he says, pe'amim ra'inu gedolim metavchim biyadam be'et hasimcha. Great Gedolei Yisrael are clapping their hands. So who are we to say, no, it's Shabbos, can't do it, can't get involved. So anyway, so that's what I told your husbands last night. Those guys who just stand on the sidelines where the rest of us are dancing around the bima on Friday night have what to feel guilty about. And I quoted for them the Rambam, and I made sure that they all understand that this is part of the mitzvah that we have to try and restore to the Jewish people. In any event, just two final things, and then I'll get to some ideas about the parsha, and we'll open up the floor. One is the Eshel Avraham, who's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, was that long Rashi script, which we won't go through now. But he says his argument as to why it's important for us to create an allowance for dancing and clapping on Shabbos and Yom Tov. He says it's because when you go to a Sheva Brachas, he says, people have no problem dancing and singing and clapping, even if it's Shabbos and Yom Tov for a chassan and a kala. And if people have no problem doing that for human beings, How can it be that, in his own words, how can it be that your table is full and God's table is empty? How can you have more joy at a chasana and show more celebration and physical exertion for the sake of the bride and the groom than you would for HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself? So that in itself, I think, is a very compelling argument. And we won't go through all of it. And he does say at the very bottom, he says, it's quite important to remember that external displays of joy, even when you're exhausted or you're depressed and you don't feel it, the very act of forcing yourself onto the dance floor actually helps you increase your joy. And so the argument, of course, is that even when you feel depressed because it's been cloudy for the last 3 months, and you don't feel like dancing, you don't feel like celebrating, you don't feel like getting involved, that's exactly the time when you have to start dancing and singing and getting involved. Yeah?
I just wanted to ask you, when I was in Israel, one of the camps we went to, it was Korobkin style, and it was phenomenal, it was wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
if you wanted to come to school, you wanted to be there, it was so energetic, nobody wanted to leave. Women were dancing on their side, the women were dancing on our side. And I always felt, why can't we incorporate something like that into...
Right. So that's what we're working towards, yeah. And if you want to, I certainly invite you all to come Friday night with your husbands and to see for yourselves, the atmosphere is very, very happy. We try to make it as happy as we can. And it's getting happier. Getting happier all the time. Okay, and then finally, this source at the very end is from the Minchas Elazar, the Munkacher Rebbe. So anyone who's from Hungarian descent would appreciate the Minchas Elazar. And he says the same thing. He says that even though Rav Hai Gaon argued that it's only for Simchas Torah that we make an exception, he asks a very basic question. If you're telling me that you can obviate and alleviate the prohibition of clapping and dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov when there's a mitzvah of Kavod Torah, well, there's a mitzvah every Yom Tov and every Shabbos. There's a mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov, isn't there? There's a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat and Simcha on Shabbat. So why shouldn't there be an alleviation of the prohibition anytime you're gathering for Simcha Shel Mitzvah, not just on Simchas Torah? And the Munkacher Rebbe's conclusion is that's actually the case, that we do actually allow a person to dance and to sing and to clap anytime that he is doing it for the sake of a mitzvah. If your heart's in the right place and you're not doing it for frivolity, but you're doing it in order to serve Hashem with simcha, like the Rambam had said, so then you have a whole litany of poskim who are very, very permissive. Unfortunately, we live in an environment sometimes where people feel that desisting from behavior is a sign of piety, is a sign of religiosity. But I say to you, and I think you'll find, hopefully you'll discover that I'm consistent in this regard. Any time that I provide a dispensation to do something, it's actually a chumrah. It's not a kula. It's a stringency. It's not a leniency. We have an obligation to be stringent in creating an environment of simcha in our synagogues. That's our chumrah for the day. All right. So take that as your chumrah from the rabbi, not as your leniency from the rabbi. Anyone want to discuss this further before we move on? Questions, comments? Yes, please.
I understand the argument you're making, but for some people, myself included, we just tend to be more reserved and quieter. And I'm quite happy to participate by enjoying other people's emotional outpouring, but it's just not.
It's not you. Yeah.
So
I think your point is extremely valid. As a matter of fact, the Eshel Avraham, which was on page 3, even makes that point. He says there is what to be said about an internal joy that is kept sublimated. He says there is even this concept in Judaism of Hatznei Alecha Sim Elokecha, walking modestly with the Lord, which means that you don't let it all hang out, that you feel this internal connection to God, but you don't share it with the rest of the world. There is what to be said about that. If that works for you, we're not saying that you're obligated to be what you're not, but you shouldn't feel suppressed either. If you feel inspired, if you feel that, you want to snap your fingers, you want to do something or other, whatever you want to do, whatever.
She'll go quiet.
Right?
She'll go quiet.
In a few months, she'll lose it out.
But absolutely, if you feel in some way that this is not you, if you feel either because of inhibitions or because you genuinely feel that your expression of joy is best when it stays within yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. Yes.
Sometimes in my experience, it's really for the men. Sometimes there's on a Shabbos, there's a chassan, there's an Avraham or something, and the men hang on to each other and walk around. I think it would be inappropriate for the ladies to start. It seems,
Don't argue with your mother. Let her finish.
Should the ladies also? It just seems like the men are doing it. Or is that just my age?
I don't know. If there are ladies who feel inspired, is there room in the ladies section to make a little circle? I see nothing wrong with it. It's not going to lead to mixed dancing. No one's jumping upstairs, right? So if
The ladies goes to say,
yeah.
The problem is in the that.
Okay.
Can't hear. What?
Okay. So there's a greater problem with schmoozing during davening than there is with dancing during davening. You understand? That's the issue. We certainly don't want to spoil the decorum by creating an atmosphere of it's a free for all. But if you're expressing your joy to Hashem with dancing, then that's what the Rambam says is the ultimate decorum. Okay. All right.
Can I ask a question? What about
Yes.
banging on the table, which is another thing when people bench and all that?
Yes. So banging on the table is, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, if I'm interpreting him correctly, would be of the same genre of clapping hands, which would be fine, because again, it's not this kind of very stylized, choreographed kind of banging. However, there are poskim who say that they limit their permissiveness of clapping only when you're using your own body. But if you're using a foreign instrument or foreign body, then they would say that it's better not to. So a person should decide for himself or herself how they want to conduct themselves. There are two sides to this argument.